While I do think Stefan Molyneux is a pseudoscientific quack with mommy issues who's totally incapable of producing anything of meaning.
Hello everyone. Today I'm making a response to Big Joel's video responding to Stefan Molyneux's video about Elliot Rodger. Stefan Molyneux's video was put out shortly after the shooting happened. This video by Big Joel was put out, I guess, earlier this year. And as you might guess from the clip I showed at the very beginning, he didn't really go into it, in good faith. And a lot of what he says in the video is extremely non-responsive. And it seems that he kind of missed the overall point of Stefan's video. The point of it, of course, was to show not that it was every single aspect, every single small detail of Elliot Rodger's life that culminated into this thing happening. In fact, as Big Joel acknowledges in his own video, Stefan Molyneux is very careful to state that none of these things are causal in and of themselves. However, in preparation for this video, I listened to the entire manifesto, and what my takeaway from it is not that it was this perfect storm of all of these things happening necessarily. It's that any one of these could have been avoided. It's that there were so many opportunities for it not happening. And Stefan Molyneux is not really taking away Elliot Rodger's agency, but he is acknowledging some parts of it that are in some ways sympathetic, and this helps us understand him as a person. But Big Joel, of course, is not interested in seeing Elliot Rodger that way. To him, Elliot Rodger is just a monster, and even though he was fairly young, early 20s at the time this happened, he still sees him as a person with 100% full agency and a 100% fully developed person. Now, he trivializes a lot of the examples that Stefan Molyneux uses, and I'm going to be going through some of those one by one just to kind of explain what I think Stefan's larger point is. And again, I think that Stefan Molyneux is using this not to say this is the one thing that caused the shooting. He's using it as a case study, as an example of lessons that can be learned from this. And Big Joel doesn't seem to be interested in learning any of those lessons, but of course I'll let you be the judge of that yourself.
At the end of the day, Elliot Rodger may have been the victim of something, if not his parents or the world around him, then of the machinations of his own mind. But we don't need to feel pity for him, or to try to explain his actions with a million meaningless straws, because he was a monster, and he is dead.
When it comes to analyzing Elliot Rodger, there's basically two camps. You have the camp that represents the mainstream, people like Big Joel, people who basically think that we need to double down on the rhetoric that's, anti-misogyny and anti-racist, right? They see that somehow him being in a society that promotes all of those narratives, that failing apparently means nothing. We just got to double down on it, right? The other camp points out that, maybe if we didn't dehumanize men and boys, and maybe if we actually did take their problems seriously, they would not think that there's only one way out of it. And when you listen to Elliot Rodger's manifesto, you can see his logic. It's based on faulty premises, but you can come to all kinds of insane and screwed up conclusions if you have one or two premises that really, aren't accurate. And the thing with Elliot Rodger's manifesto also is that it's very honest. He admits to a lot of things that are extremely embarrassing. He was an extremely emotional person, and he is recalling in very great detail, very specific events that seem quite small, things that even Elliot Rodger himself acknowledges can be quite small, and can very clearly tie together how it makes him feel and why it makes him feel that way and what conclusions he's drawing from it. Now, what this makes me think is that, if he had anyone in his life who took his problems seriously anybody who he could have openly and honestly discussed these things with, then some people may have challenged some of his underlying premises and given him a little bit of hope. But instead, the way that incels are treated is that they're basically just a bunch of pathetic losers.
So, looking at the life and manifesto of Elliot Rodger, we can't just point to every event that happened to him and say, don't do that, 'cause just look what happened. It's far too narrow. Instead, we can only judge and advise against those actions that are themselves harmful, that do or transparently lead to obvious damage.
This is the main point of departure with the examples that we're going to go through. Basically, Molyneux would argue, as I would agree, that the things that he's pointing out are things that actually harm people. And I think that part of the reason Big Joel is struggling to acknowledge that this is harmful is that we're talking about a male victim.
But here's the thing. Stefan Molyneux actually sidesteps this problem, and he does so by implicitly claiming one of the strangest things imaginable. What if, basically, everything that ever happened to Elliot Rodger was bad? What if all of his experiences deserve judgment because they are all harmful or maladaptive or wrong, particularly those things related to his upbringing?
So we agree that he doesn't state this explicitly. I will disagree. He does not imply this either. In fact, what he does is he focuses on things and offers some reasoning for why he thinks they're harmful. In other words, it's the same paradigm that you're presenting in regards to judging particular instances and trying to take away lessons from it.
Like, look at how Stefan talks about Elliot's first experience going to school.
So Elliot goes on to say, I was forced to wear a uniform, which I hated because I had to wear uncomfortable socks up to my knees. I was very nervous and cried on my first day there. I didn't like school at Dorset House very much.
Now, reading this part of the manifesto, I might say, sure, that's hard. And when I was a kid, I cried the first time I went to school and wanted to see my mom again. But that's normal, right? The difficulty of growing up. But to Stefan, no. You should listen to your child, and to do otherwise is appalling parenting.
So this is important. There's a certain ethic or approach to parenting, which goes along the lines of, well, I know what's best for you, and therefore I don't have to listen to what you don't like. I consider this appalling parenting. Appalling parenting, you listen to the child. If the child is crying and doesn't want to go away to school, then that is something you need to take into account. Doesn't mean you have to indulge your child's every whim. It's not sort of one extreme to the other, but these are important things to listen to with regards to your children.
And sure, he goes out of his way to say that he's not claiming we should indulge our child's every whim, but it's hard to see another takeaway from his position here. I mean, all Elliot wrote was that he had to go to a school he didn't like. The reactions of his parents to this information aren't even mentioned.
It's obvious that Big Joel hasn't considered that unschooling and homeschooling are things, and he doesn't seem to know anything about peaceful parenting. And this is the perspective that Stefan Molyneux is coming from, especially around this time period when he made this video. So I guess that's why this idea seems so alien to him. But, you know, Molyneux, I think, very clearly stated some of the limits of it. Now, to Big Joel, he's not even questioning this. You know, the idea that you just force kids to do things is just taken for granted. And that's part of what Molyneux is criticizing. And I think that's a very important thing to highlight. Now, as for this point of, well, we don't know how the parents reacted to this, I think that it would have been mentioned if it were out of character for them. And when you listen to all of the accounts that are included in the manifesto, it's a very, very obvious kind of contextual clue. Like, you know that they just forced him to do this. That was very much the style of parenting characterized in the manifesto.
Or later on, Stefan looks at a place in Elliot's manifesto where he discusses masturbating and having sexual fantasies that he didn't talk about with his parents.
In fact, I didn't talk to my parents at all about my sexual development. I felt too guilty and embarrassed about it. Whenever they probed me, I lied to them, telling them that I had no sex drive. My mother once caught me looking at pictures of girls online, and I frantically had to convince her that I stumbled on those pictures by accident.
And of course, when I read this, I'm like, yeah, of course he had those fantasies. Of course he lied about them to his parents. And I'm not saying we should shame sexual desire among teenagers, but that doesn't mean you have to talk about that stuff with your mom. It can be embarrassing and weird, and I know I acted that way with my mother and continue that wonderful tradition to this very day. But to Stefan, this is evidence of some big pattern of isolation.
You can't start talking with your kids when they're 15. You have to have the conversation. I started chatting with my daughter when she was still in her mother's womb, for heaven's sakes. You have to have conversations that go on for years before you can talk about the difficult things. You need to talk about the easy things. You can't just jump in the deep end without having that connection with your children.
You have to talk to your kids. Start off early with the easy stuff, so that later on you can get to the somehow desirable point where you're exchanging sexual fantasies with the people who birthed you. Again, this passage of the manifesto somehow works as evidence that there was bad behavior on the part of these parents.
The overall point of that section had to do with his shame in general at his development. And I think that it's really disingenuous to package it as, oh, well, obviously this is what Stefan Molyneux wants. He wants people to talk about all kinds of sexual things with their parents. What he's talking about is having a sort of relationship with your children where you're able to have difficult conversations. And I'm not sure how he could have stated this any more clearly. This white knighting for the parents is, I think, very odd. You know, it's obvious that their parenting should be scrutinized because they had opportunities to avoid this. And if you listen to the actual manifesto, if you actually pay attention to what he's saying, you know, why did all this rage get pent up? Why did he feel like he couldn't share any of this with them? I think this actually really does get to the heart of the issue, is he didn't feel like he had anyone on his side, even amongst his own parents. Now, you might think that's normal, but, you know, normal doesn't mean good. And I think Stefan Molyneux here is calling for a higher standard for parents, which is something that Western society, really most societies, really desperately need.
And these examples get even more ridiculous and threadbare somehow. Elliot's mother making him attend camp.
At 11 years old, he writes, I was enjoying a lovely summer, but suddenly my mother said that I had to go to summer camp. I didn't like this one bit. It was a last-minute decision. One moment I was relaxing and enjoying my summer break. The next, my mother is waking me up early to take me to my first day of camp.
Stefan assumes that she did this with no warning. Another example of Elliot's parents not preparing him in the ways that they should have.
And again, we see this can't trust, can't relax, is not prepared for things, is not aware of what's coming down the road. Everything is bam, bam, just comes in out of nowhere.
But for one, there is no textual evidence that their sending him to this camp was this sudden. Sure, he says it was a bit last minute, but he makes it clear that his parents explained their rationale for this decision before the day he had to wake up early. This was a decision she made with my father because they thought it would be healthy for me.
That quote doesn't even prove what you said it proves. It just says that at some point he was speculating on what their reasoning was. It doesn't give us any information about when this conversation was had. So Stefan's point stands. And also, as part of a larger theme of him moving around a lot and things constantly changing and him feeling like he had no control over it. So, you know, to nitpick this as though it's like some small irrelevant thing, it was actually a pretty large theme. I'm not sure how you missed it.
What an awful mom.
Both his stepmother and his mother are very attractive women and are cold and cruel. At least the stepmother is, by his report. He doesn't say much about his mother, but his mother did just wake him up out of nowhere and say, you're going to camp.
But more importantly, Elliot writes about enjoying his time at the camps he went to. In both of the other two sections where he talks about camp, he describes being unhappy at first, but then growing to enjoy it, playing games, watching movies, making friends. And what sets this particular camp experience apart is specifically that he had his first bad experience with a girl. So why are we judging these parents for sending their kid to a place that they knew him to enjoy?
Well, this is an ends justify the means argument, which means that by definition, his parents wouldn't know that because they would need the ends to have already happened in order for it to justify their means.
We don't need to feel pity for him or to try to explain his actions with a million meaningless straws, because he was a monster, and he is dead, and nothing remains of him. That is, except for one thing, his beliefs, his politics, his art. And don't kid yourself, Elliot Rodger's art is vital. I don't think we have to argue against him like he's espousing some coherent political ideology. I'd actually recommend not doing that. But we should recognize that we can see his ideas reflected back at us in a million places. Most obviously, we have the incel community. Even during Elliot Rodger's life, this community started gaining traction on forums like PUA Hate. But it's only grown since then.
Well, his politics were the Young Turks. It's actually a shockingly apolitical document. As for his beliefs, sure, he had some beliefs about women, he had some beliefs about men. It was obvious that the underlying thread was gynocentrism. He was somebody who saw the approval of women as the only measure of a man's value. And this is an assumption that is going to go completely unchallenged if we leave this in the hands of feminists or people like Big Joel.
We can just look at the guy who's talking to us, Stefan Molyneux. Like Elliot, Stefan is a white supremacist.
First of all, I've always been skeptical of the ideas of white nationalism, of identitarianism, and white identity. However, I am an empiricist, and I could not help but notice that I could have peaceful, free, easy, civilized, and safe discussions in what is essentially an all-white country.
And once again, we have an example offered that doesn't even prove his conclusion. Molyneux has been very clear with his stance on these issues, and the idea that he's a white supremacist is completely ridiculous. Instead, what he'll state is that, we do have to look at the evidence, and that doesn't mean that there's only one explanation, but instead it'll help us figure out what's going on. And I think the fact that he's demonized in this way just for asking questions about it is really suspicious and really counterproductive. But again, it's just more kind of poisoning the well. Big Joel's going to try to argue that this supposed white supremacism on the part of Stefan Molyneux somehow is reflected in Elliot Rodger. And it seems to be that for Elliot Rodger, the racial element was more just fetishization. He just personally believed that white people were the most beautiful. There was some aspect of, I guess, class involved with it. But really this idea that, you need to have separatism or need to have an ethno-state in order to have a cohesive society, there's absolutely nothing in the manifesto that links those at all. Instead, this is more just an example of people throwing around these terms just because, that it's a magic spell. He says, this person's a white supremacist or white separatist, therefore they're the devil, therefore I don't have to really engage with what they're saying, is really what it comes down to. He's never going to make any sort of rational causal link between this supposed white supremacy on the part of Elliot Rodger compared to Molyneux.
Like Elliot, he thinks that women are often incapable of choosing their partners properly. He thinks that because of the modern dysfunctional structure of society, they're now incentivized to choose the poor, aggressive men instead of the richer, nicer, kinder ones.
And it really wasn't until the free market that nice guys got the edge. And then nice guys were getting the edge, competent guys were getting the edge, decent guys were getting the edge. And then the asshole said, okay, well, let's just swarm to the state, get a welfare state, and now we're back on top. Now women can go for jerks and aggressive people and so on. Because the guy who's really good at getting resources in a primitive society usually ends up broke, poor, or in jail in a free society.
He's correct. Women do make bad choices. Not all of them, but certainly some of them do. If you recognize female agency, that means you have to recognize that at times they're going to use this agency poorly. And I think his argument that free market capitalism incentivizes basically good genes and non-aggressive behavior, I don't really see any problem with that argument. And of course, Big Joel isn't really going to give us an argument. He's just disgusted by it, I guess. I think the argument is perfectly reasonable.
And like Elliot, he thinks that women have to be held accountable in some way.
All the cold-hearted jerks who run the world came out of the vaginas of women who married assholes. And I don't know how to make the world a better place without holding women accountable for choosing assholes. Your dad was an asshole because your mother chose him. Because it works on so many women.
He's correct. This is an issue where women have more power in the sexual marketplace, and they could unilaterally end a lot of suffering if they would just choose better. And when he says they should be held responsible, Big Joel keeps it vague here because he wants to create this connotation like it's somehow nefarious. He's saying cut off their welfare. He's saying make them accountable for their own actions. They have to actually provide for themselves and can't just rely on the government. That's the clear implication if you're at all familiar with Molyneux's views. But it could also mean that you hold them socially responsible, which is to say that you stop constantly making excuses. You say, hey, you made a bad decision. I'm attributing ownership of the bad decision to you.
Now, I'm not saying that Stefan is pro-mass murder or something like that, but his political connection with Elliot Rodger is undeniable.
Well, he opposes the initiation of violent force, and at no point acknowledges that anything that Elliot Rodger cites as a justification for initiating force would be a justification, or would be considered retaliation even. Later, he'll mention that there's an entitlement aspect, right, based on leftism, and argues that, well, maybe this kind of opens the door. This seems to be the only way to create a political connection. Molyneux acknowledges that it's a kind of a thin one, but if it goes unquestioned, I can definitely see that being part of the logic there. Let's see, as far as misogyny, well, I mean, he had more male victims than female victims. Although he had a gynocentric focus, it was obvious that he didn't have a higher opinion of men. And certainly from an empirical standpoint, it didn't result in more female victims than male victims. So, actually, I would say this is deniable. This is quite deniable. And I think that the only reason you're even trying to make these connections is just because you use words in a way that's way too vague. People who are progressive, who are leftist, who are liberal, tend to stretch the definition of misogyny. They tend to stretch the definition of white supremacy. They tend to stretch the definition of racism. This is a trend that we've been seeing for many, many years. So it doesn't surprise me that you're just going to 6 degrees of separation anyone into supporting terrorists, even when the core of their beliefs are diametrically opposed.
He fundamentally agrees with him on a wide variety of topics. In fact, their similarity is probably the reason why Stefan didn't want to talk about this stuff in the first place. After all, he feels no compunction politicizing these murders when he can somehow paint Elliot's crime as an example of racism against white people.
But his hatred was for blonde white girls. And that is as much a racial crime as it is a gender crime. The gender is the result of him being heterosexual and rejected by women, but the racial element is very specific.
By the standards that we acknowledge any form of racism, I think that the bar is met here, and I don't really see any reason to argue against that. There is one point where he has an altercation with an Asian guy, but fundamentally it was because that there was a blonde girl that was giving the Asian guy more attention. So, even when you can try to think of examples where racially it was a non-white person, fundamentally there's a white chick involved. So it is important to note that.
And if you can imagine, if a half white guy had targeted only black women, then this would be a racial hate crime.
Or when he claims that leftist politics were another straw on his back.
Leftism, egalitarianism, liberalism, socialism, communism, all of the evening out ideologies may perhaps play a role, a small role to be fair, in this idea that violence is perfectly acceptable in redistributing the goods of this world.
Yeah, this is a perfectly valid argument. If you acknowledge socialism or liberalism or any form of government redistribution, you might as well redistribute the pussy. You might as well redistribute anything. There's really no reason to draw a line there. So, yeah, if anyone to the left of an anarcho-capitalist, I do see you basically fundamentally as rapists and murderers and thieves. So that just logically holds up. I don't think there's any issue with that argument at all.
But when it comes to this being a crime of misogyny and white supremacy, actually being reflective of ideologies that real people have and disseminate to their massive audiences, nope, let's avoid politics there.
So I guess you're upset at Molyneux for not making the argument that you failed to make.
I wanted to prove to them all that girls liked me, to see the look on their faces when they see a girl by my side. But of course, I had nothing to prove because girls didn't like me. Every time I tried to go out and meet a girl, I ended up walking home in anger. On one of these nights, I crossed paths with a boy who was walking with two pretty girls. I got so envious that I cursed at them, and then I followed them for a few minutes. They just laughed at me, and one of the girls kissed the boy on the lips. I'm assuming she was his girlfriend. That was one of the worst experiences of torture from girls that I've had to endure, and it will be a scar in my memory forever, to remind me that girls think I'm unworthy compared to other boys. I ran home with tears pouring down my cheeks, hoping that my horrible housemates wouldn't be there to witness my shame. My whole world was twisted. Within the following days, I spent a lot of time at the park, watching the wind blow through the trees and the children playing in the fields. I questioned the very fabric of reality. Why did this all exist, I wondered. How did life come to be? What was the nature of reality? What was my place in all of it? There was no point to my life anymore. I was never going to lose my virginity. I was never going to get a girlfriend. Because girls are repulsed by me, I was never going to have children and pass on my genes. The only way that I could have been worthy enough to beautiful girls is if I became wealthy at a young age. And the faith I had in that happening had just been crushed. There was no hope left. The life I could have had ceased to exist. I will never have sex, never have love, never have children. I will never be a creator, but I could be a destroyer. Life had been cruel to me. The human species had rejected me all my life, despite the fact that I am the ideal, magnificent gentleman. Life itself is twisted and disgusting, I mused. Humans are brutal animals. If I cannot thrive among them, then I will destroy them all. I didn't want things to turn out this way. I wanted a happy, healthy life of love and sex. But if I'm unable to have such a life, then I will have no choice but to exact revenge on the society that denied it to me. My new housemates moved into the other room of my apartment at the end of September. They didn't know each other before they moved in, which was better for me because then they wouldn't gang up on me. Not like they would do such a thing anyway, since my two new housemates were both timid, geeky types. One of them was a funny-looking curly-haired boy named Chris Rugg, and the other was an Asian American named John. After the first few days of their stay, I felt content with these new housemates. They were quiet, respectful, and very friendly. And best of all, they never invited any friends over. I doubt they even had any friends. All they did was stay in their room and played video games all day. Of course, I had no desire to be friends with them, because they had absolutely nothing to offer, but I knew I would have no problems with them in my apartment, and that was the best I could hope for. On Halloween weekend, I made the wise decision to go home to my mother's house. There was no way I was going to torture myself by staying alone in my room while the entire town of Isla Vista erupted in debauchery. All of the tall, hunky jocks that girls love so much will be having all of the sex and all of the fun, while an unwanted outcast like myself would rot in loneliness. I imagined that some attractive guys who only visited Isla Vista for the Halloween event will be getting laid that weekend. They'd be getting sex from just one night in Isla Vista, while I'm still a virgin after living there for over a year. It was too unfair. I wanted to punish them all. I imagined how sweet it would be to slaughter all of those evil, slutty bitches who rejected me, along with the fraternity jocks they throw themselves at. To see them all running from me in fear as I kill them left and right would be the ultimate retribution. Only then would I have all the power. They treated me like an insignificant little mouse, but on the day of retribution, I would be a god to them. They will be the mice, and I will be the predator. I considered setting the date for the day of retribution to be the next Halloween of 2013. That would give me a year to prepare, but I soon dismissed it. If the day of retribution were to happen, it would have to be on a normal weekend. There would be too many cops walking around during an event like Halloween, and cops are the only ones who could hinder my plans. I spent the time at Mother's house relaxing and trying to forget about Halloween. I drank some of my mother's delicious wine until I was too buzzed to think about how much fun everyone else my age was having on that night. I didn't even bother to register for college classes that semester. There was no point. I believed that I would either fulfill my dream of becoming wealthy at a young age in order to be worthy enough to attract beautiful women, or exact my revenge upon the world and die in the process to escape punishment. There was no other path for me. Of course, I registered for some classes, but only to keep up the pretense to my parents that I was still attending college. If they somehow found out that I had dropped my classes right after registering for them, they would have stopped all of their support for me, and my life would have to end right then and there. Thankfully, I was a good liar. During the autumn of 2012, I had all the time in the world to figure out how I was going to triumph against the society that was torturing me. I spent a lot of time at the library in Goleta, just a few miles away from Isla Vista. At the library, I read countless books on history, business, and philosophy, learning as much as I could. It was better than staying at home in my room. Besides, I didn't want my housemates to find out that I wasn't going to college. That would be embarrassing, and I always cared about what others thought of me, even my nerdy housemates. I continued to visit the website of the Mega Millions lottery. I still clung to the hope that it may rise above $100 million again and I would be the winner. So far, I saw that as my only way out of my horrible situation. My situation was indeed horrible. I couldn't leave the house without seeing a young couple walking around somewhere. Everywhere I went, I was all by myself, while other young people had friends and girlfriends. I was ashamed to show myself to the world. Even though I wore expensive designer clothes, what was the point if girls weren't attracted to me? No one respects a man who is unable to get a woman. A man wearing shorts and a t-shirt would be seen as superior to me if he walks into a store with a beautiful girl on his arms and I walk in all alone. A man having a beautiful girl by his side shows the world that he is worth something, because obviously that beautiful girl sees some sort of worth in him. If a man is all alone, people get the impression that girls are repulsed by him, and therefore he is a worthless loser. I saw winning the lottery as the only way out, and I became so frustrated when the Mega Millions jackpot kept resetting. In the end of November, the jackpot was very close to getting high enough, but then it sank to the bottom once again. It was at this point that I learned about the Powerball lottery. The Powerball hadn't yet come to California, so I knew nothing about it before. I looked at the website and saw that the jackpot was over $500 million. California didn't have a Powerball lottery, so in order to buy a ticket, I would have to drive all the way to Arizona. Earlier in that day, as I drove through Isla Vista, I saw this one particular young couple that stood out from the rest because the girl looked absolutely perfect. She was tall, blonde, and sexy. She would have towered over me in height, and her boyfriend, of course, towered over her. They were both wearing beach gear, and the girl was in her bikini, showing off to everyone her sensual, erection-causing body. Her blonde hair was wet from swimming in the ocean, and it only made her look more arousing. The two of them were holding hands, and it was clear that they were in love. I saw the boyfriend place his hand on the girl's ass, and when he did this, the girl looked at him and smiled with delight. That guy was in heaven. I can only imagine how amazing it must be to have sex with a girl like that. I had to witness everything I wanted but could not have. It made me feel dizzy with anguish. I immediately thought about that couple, and how impossible it was for me to have the same experience as that guy. Impossible, as I was at that point. But it would be possible for me to get a tall, blonde, sexy girlfriend if I was a multi-millionaire. Oh yes, it would be very possible. Becoming a multi-millionaire is the only way I could have such an experience. And winning the lottery was the only way I could become a multi-millionaire at my age. As I stared at the Powerball jackpot that was over $500 million, I knew that I had to win it. It was midnight when I had this revelation, and the drawing was on the following day. The only way I could get a ticket before the drawing was if I left for Arizona right there and then. And so, that is exactly what I did. I quickly looked up the best route on Google Maps, packed some food in my backpack, and took off. The sun rose as I crossed the long stretch of desert between Palm Springs and the border of Arizona. It was one of the most beautiful things I had ever seen when I saw the sun creeping up before me in the horizon, igniting the clouds with its orange glow. I proclaimed that sunrise as the sunrise of my destiny. I was riding towards my destiny to obtain the record-breaking Powerball ticket of $500 million. As I drove, I thought about every event in my life that led up to that journey. I considered that journey as the ultimate culmination of the tragic suffering and sexual starvation I had to go through for so long. That Powerball jackpot was meant for me. Once I won it, I'd be able to have my beautiful blonde girlfriend. I'd be able to show the world that girls consider me worthy. I'd be able to show the world how superior I am. And of course, I would be able to live above everyone who has wronged me and rub it all in their faces as a form of gratifying vengeance. That was my ultimate purpose in life, my reason for living.